How are you all? So I think we've got 16 or 17 members who are going to talk. The leader is one of them, and we'll let him talk when he gets here. Anytime a new airline executive comes to see me, I say there are two things that every member of Congress thinks they're an expert on. One is elections, and one is air travel. And so you're going to hear a lot this week from a lot of experts, particularly I think our friends on the other side are going to be talking about bills that I believe that they have generally not looked at, haven't read, have decided that somehow state legislatures are universally committed to voter suppression. Voter suppression, really, I've never seen that public voter suppression as a very good political tactic. And I would say, looking at these bills carefully, what I think you'll find, and I look forward to the exceptions you might come up with that I haven't come up with, is that state after state leaned forward, as you would hope they would in the pandemic, and added some additional voting things that they had never had before. And in virtually every case, and again, I haven't found an exception, there may be one, but it would be the exception that proves the rule. In virtually every case, when that election was over, they looked at what they had done and said, how much of that should we keep? And I think state after state have changed their laws in a way that it will be easier to vote going forward than it was to vote in 2018. My mother used to say, no good deed goes unpunished. And what we don't want to do here, though we may have already done it, is teach the lesson: if you try to adjust to a momentary challenge, when you try to dial that back, everybody will assume that you're trying to do bad things instead of trying to save the best of the things that you try to do. And whether that's voting by mail or drop boxes or days of early voting, I think you're going to find that the bills they're going to be talking about this week generally have more of all of those than states like New York and Delaware and Connecticut, and we look forward to talking about that. Also want to remember that the basic framework for the big election bills, whether it's the John Lewis Act or whatever the name is of the other bill that is hundreds of pages, the basis for that is H.R. 1, which in fact passed the year before the 2020 elections were over, and suddenly it's the 2020 elections why you have to change the election law for everything Democrats have always wanted to do in ways that they've always believed give them advantages in the whole election process. And so we're going to be talking about that this week on the floor. There'll be time for questions, and I'll be here for questions, and others will that choose to stay when members have had a chance to talk. But we're going to start with Mr. Brasso and then Mr. Langford, and there's a list right here that you all will follow.
Well, the Democrats this week are focused on what they consider the #1 priority for them. That's why they labeled the bill S1, H.R. 1. It is the Democrats' #1 priority, and they are wanting to rig the rules of the Senate to get it passed. Now, that doesn't mean it's the #1 priority of the American people. People across the country are concerned about things like inflation and COVID and crime in the cities and the crisis at the southern border. But for the Democrats, they think the #1 thing affecting the country is they want Washington to take over elections in the United States. So what really is the most important questions? Well, Gallup had a recent poll on this. And what Gallup says is the #1 issue is economy, poor leadership at the federal level, COVID, immigration, and this issue of election reform. That came in at number 23. It was only an asterisk in the Gallup poll as an issue of concern for the American people, when the American people know what's of concern to them. So Senator Blunt mentioned local election officials. I've heard from our Secretary of State, Ed Buchanan, and let me just share a few of the things that he says about elections. And he says, number one, I'm writing to oppose and express my opposition to the Democrats' attempt to federalize our elections. He goes on and says Senator Schumer's statements are offensive on their face, suggesting that Republican-led state legislators pass laws designed for the purpose of voter suppression, he says, is slanderous and is a political lie to the American people. He said, interestingly, in Senator Schumer's home state of New York, they are moving forward in some jurisdictions with plans to allow non-citizens to vote. Based on this, he says, it is clear that Democrats want to change the rules whenever they think they can gain an advantage at the polls. He goes on, this is right in line with their wish to change the filibuster rules in the U.S. Senate. Because the Democrat agenda does not resonate with everyday working Americans, they must resort to less than honorable tactics. They do not seem to understand that it is their misguided policies, giving catalyst to rising energy and food costs, that are their biggest impediments to election, not Republican state legislatures that want to protect election integrity. And to me, that's what it's about: ballot integrity, ballot accountability, ballot security, and that's what we're here fighting to defend.
Well, in the past 6 years, Democrats in the Senate have filibustered bills and nominations 589 times. In the past 6 years, 589 times. Now, less than 1 year into the Biden presidency, they've suddenly declared that the filibuster is unfair and it's overused. So they're planning to remake the Senate in their own image, where the voice of the minority is no longer heard and no longer respected. That's the plan for the Democrats. Stop allowing the minority voice to be heard. To be clear, the debate this week is not about voting rights. Federal courts already have the full ability to stay any law in any jurisdiction in any state in America that suppresses any voter or any group of voters. That's in federal law right now. This whole conversation about voter suppression is already protected by federal courts right now. The debate this week that Senator Schumer is bringing is about silencing the voice of the minority in the Senate and everyone that we represent, literally silencing half the country. This is not about protecting our republic or our election. This is about Democrats in Washington taking over every election in every state. This is about Senator Schumer's power. That's what this is all about. He's willing to destroy more than 2 centuries of tradition in the Senate to get his way. That's not my opinion. Actually, that's Senator Schumer's opinion. Senator Schumer, just a few years ago, stood on the floor of the Senate and said, I hope the Republican leader and I can, in the coming months, find a way to build a firewall around the legislative filibuster, which is the most important distinction between the Senate and the House. Senator Schumer continued saying this, without the 60-vote threshold for legislation, the Senate becomes a majoritarian institution like the House, much more subject to the whims of short-term electoral change. No senator would like to see that happen. So let's find a way to protect the 60-vote rule for legislation. I agree with that, Senator Schumer. I also agree with Dick Durbin. When in 2018, Dick Durbin was asked about the legislative filibuster, and he said, I would tell you it would be the end of the Senate as it was originally devised and created, going back to our founding fathers. I also agree with the 27 other Democrat senators that wrote a letter to Mitch McConnell and to Senator Schumer in 2017 asking for there to be no changes in the legislative filibuster. In that letter, they wrote this: we're asking you to join us in opposing any effort to curtail the existing rights and prerogatives of senators to engage in full, robust, and extended debate as we consider legislation before this body and in the future. I would tell you they asked me to join them in opposing any effort to change the legislative filibuster. I agree. I will. And that is completely my plan to be able to do that. We will not allow them to silence half the country.
You're up, Ted.
Good morning. Chuck Schumer and the Democrats are desperate
to break the Senate rules and try to engage in a corrupt power grab. This bill that they're pushing, the Corrupt Politicians Act, would undermine democracy across the country. It takes laws adopted by democratically elected legislatures and subjects them to the arbitrary veto of politically radical, unelected bureaucrats at the Department of Justice. President Biden has nominated hard-left ideologues to the Department of Justice, including two of the leading advocates of abolishing the police in the country. And what Chuck Schumer and the Democrats are proposing is putting those ideologues in charge of election laws across this country. What Schumer and the Democrats are trying to do is strike down every single voter ID law in the country, even though 80% of Americans support them, even though a large majority of African American voters support voter ID laws. Democrats have decided that voter fraud benefits them politically, and they're willing to go to any length to tear down the reasonable common sense protections that protect the integrity of our elections. They're willing to go so far as breaking the rules of the Senate to end the filibuster. Now, if you want to know the consequences of that, you may perhaps be skeptical of Republicans. If you're not a Republican, you may be from a different political view. So I want to point you to someone who's not a Republican, assessing the consequences of what Chuck Schumer is proposing right now. That person is a person by the name of Charles Schumer, who in 2005, March 16th, 2005, said about nuking the Senate rules and ending the filibuster. Here's what Chuck Schumer said. They want, because they can't get their way, to change the rules midstream, to wash away 200 years of history. They want to make this